This series of diagrams was originally prepared for discussion purposes, but I thought it would be more understandable if I added a commentary. In general, people do not like diagrams. This is unfortunate for Lacanians, because Lacan is famous for his diagrams. I was motivated by a recent conversation about Lacan's famous butterfly diagram, where we see, or think we see, two intersecting triangles that represent two cones of vision, one extending from the subject as a viewer to a plane where the subject generates another viewer whose gaze looks back from a point that is more accurately described as a hole in space. The two triangles are a model for the Lacanian imaginary, but in Seminar 13, The Object of Psychoanalysis, Lacan's colleague and former analysand, Javier O'Dwyer, presented an alternative reading of the butterfly, where instead of two triangles, he proposed two crisscross parallelograms. This was a kind of tangram reading, where the same lines support both readings. Lacan did not really understand O'Dwyer's point, and I have always thought it interesting that no Lacanians have stepped forward to defend him, at least not to my knowledge. What I'd like to do in this series of images is to argue that the imaginary is a permeable barrier, a boundary that has apotropic warnings posted just where the unconscious would like to cross. The best point of access is the position of the butterfly known as the screen, where there is a balance between the forces of the look and the gaze. Vulnerable, because this crossing involves a puzzle, and for me at least, every puzzle is a kind of induction puzzle, where self-intersection involves non-orientation, in the same way the Borromeo knot of the real, symbolic, and imaginary hold together with a funny kind of twist. Talking about this twist in terms of induction requires us to look at the Borromeo knot as one member of a family of knots, first known as the Gordian knot, a classic puzzle, all the more Lacanian because Dionysus immortalized the cyclic sacrifice of kings, and the knot was said to have been a cipher code for his real name, which we might call the name of the father. Thus the Gordian knot was Freud's dream of the primal horde come true. The tradition of mumbling at Dionysus's altar invites us to think of cipher knots in relation to la langue, and look at this formula for the Fibonacci phi as a kind of Rosetta Stone. The thing we need to know about the golden ratio is that two things change at once. So there is in this curve that expands and contracts to the same infinity as a 2-to-1 ratio. The sequence of numbers that define the curve are the sums of the previous two numbers, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and so on. But we have to remember that the sequence really begins with 0. Standing opposite the external infinity is an interior infinity that is both the 0 as a number and a not number, an indivisible remainder that is carried throughout the curve as its irrational component. The two things that change simultaneously are the curve that is visible and the center, which keeps moving along the sides of the squares that form the series. We have to use the two visible squares with sides of 1 as a fractal to break into the interior that at first seems impossible, but which is held fast by the zero's indivisibility. Remember that the Indians discovered the phi long before Fibonacci, so maybe they can tell you how this works. Our take-home lesson is that every one thing involves two things. So this move to the radical interior involves the way the outside is the same as the inside. In Seminar 14, The Logic of Fantasy, we run across something that, to my knowledge, has never been discussed. This is Lacan's analogy of the golden section to the slide rule, a mechanical device used by engineers and architects before the age of handheld calculators. Imagine how Lacan ever thought to use this antique to crack the secret of the irreducible remainder. The key thing to remember is that the slide rule uses logarithmic scales based on the powers of numbers, not the arithmetic numbers. This made it possible to show how the zero of the series could be a kind of vanishing point that you could pursue by subtracting higher and higher powers of the A, standing for the OGA. Being something smaller than 1, higher powers of A would be smaller and smaller. To show the ratio as a formula, you say that 1 plus A to 1 is the same ratio as the 1 to A. Multiplying things out gives you the procedure for sliding the A inside the 1 interval to find the remainder A squared. You repeat the procedure, sliding the A squared into the A to get the A cubed, and so on and so on. Not only do you find that the indivisible remainder lies wherever the power of A reaches infinity, but you see the powers alternate in an odd and even way. Lacan helpfully defines the 1 as the unary, which we associate with the repetition of demand, and the A is the OGA, that we associate with jouissance. The odd and even alternation seems to be in keeping with the bipolarity of jouissance, but makes this into a kind of parallax of left and right, aiming at a vanishing point. This circles around to the theme of the unary trait being not a simple numerical 1, but a 1 of 1, a 1 of itself. The name for this doubling is audioactive. And the golden ratio seems to duplicate this when it begins its series with 2 1s, with the cause of this the involvement of the zero. If you think of the zero and indivisible remainder as the real, the symbolic becomes the procedure of back and forth sliding, and the imaginary is created with the construction of the vanishing point. Who knew that you could work out the Borromeo knot with a slide rule? Probably you can also find the real name of Dionysus. Freud had trouble thinking of the neural system as a circuit because he needed it to do 2 things: seek pleasure, but also at the same time create impossible problems for itself. The pleasure principle and the death drive actually forced the circuit into a condition of triples, because, and it was only Lacan who figured this out, the neural system used repetition to create a temporality unique to the human neural network, where every signifier would have embedded in its structure this idea of an unlimited continuing series and a self-negation. This property of being both an again and still only 1 was what Freud was looking for, and the death drive came close, but he wasn't able to mathematize it. Lacan rather quickly discovered that it wasn't possible to do this with natural numbers, but only topological things like curves, folds, and twists. With topology, you could use something that the system forbade. In other words, you could work with a symbolic that could point at a non- or anti-symbolic, namely the real, like the little I that is the square root of -1, a number that is not a number. Think of this as a Gordian knot. The rope is fully symbolic, but the structure is a puzzle. What the 1 and 0 open up is a hole in the symbolic real antagonism that becomes the imaginary. This line is not a passage through the hole, but just the opposite, a barrier to passage. It is a puzzle or riddle that must be answered before the R can rejoin the S, But this reunion will take place entirely in the medium of their mutual structural relationship, that is to say, the knot that they form that is held together by the riddle. If you have been wondering why I am so keen on talking about induction, triplicity is the answer. It is the way that the structure of the signifier and the structure of the unconscious as real, as the traumatic inner feature that structures the symbolic, creates a barrier that is the imaginary, which is to say the world we live in, so that the signifier can find its hidden name, the name that, so to speak, precedes the name of the Father. This sounds like crazy talk at this point, because we have not visualized triplicity in any way that makes sense. We need an experiment to find out how the problem of making a simple circuit requires 3 different component parts. We need the idea that 2 things can be separated but still act as if they were connected, what in quantum physics is called spooky correspondence. This is actually the circle's most enigmatic property, the way the center is reflected in the curve of the perimeter. It is the object that causes the circle to desire to curve in on itself. The second way we see this curve is in 2 parts, each of which mirrors the other, but from opposite positions. Add these 2 models together, and you get the third part of triplicity, an inversion of the point to the circumference and the circumference to the circle, which is simply another way of writing parts 1 and 2, but this way of drawing it shows that there is a void created in the middle. In the same way, a central void is made by the 3 Borromeo rings. We are now in the position to take another look at the butterfly design, to see how these 2 things become a third thing that involves a void. When unicity and duplicity create inversion, or what Lacan would call extimacy, the intimate exterior, it becomes possible to use a new set of terms to say what has happened. In the simplest case of unicity, the center of the circle looks like the thing that caused the circle to bend around. If the center is true, the circumference will be true. But the duplicity model combines unicity with inversion. It's the Jekyll-Hyde element where a true-false relation turns into a false-true. When we refine duplicity, it boils down to a pure form of inversion, where there are 2 false conditions that mirror each other in reverse. As weird as this sounds, it is the commonplace situation of the murder mystery, the type 1 error of putting the wrong guy in jail while committing the type 2 error of letting the guilty guy run free. Inversion uses 2 error conditions in the same way the unicity model used 2 positives. By using 2 false things, we have a condition of pure structure. This is the OGA that is part of the symbolic that is pure relations, no content. It ain't what you say, it's the way that you say it. This makes inversion the stuff of the unconscious, exactly the way that Freud said it was in his essay on negation. It's the structure of the symbolic, the real of it, that allows us to find a treasure of evidence in ethnology. People who devise diverse cultural practices are not theorists. They don't think about the triple model. They just seem to know how to put it into practice. This is why culture, as Freud put it, is both a high achievement and, in the end, a mess. Self-destruction is built in, because the name of the Father will never be enough for the structure that finds its autonomy and wishes to take the red pill that Morpheus offers Nemo in The Matrix. We Lacanians are all taking the red pill, not the blue pill that psychologists are allowed to take. The red pill allows us to look under the hood of the real of the symbolic, and we find the symbolic all over the place. Each component of the circuit, unicity, duplicity, and inversion, has its own fan club of examples, where its graphic structure is used as a blueprint for the realities of things like plays, rituals, artworks, film scripts, myths, and motifs. Don't forget to take your slide rule along to work out the way that all this is generated by the unary trait and the OGA. These three circle options have the same production logic, but their effects are all over the place, and the three circle options do the sorting. Ethnology and popular culture give us a means of corroborating our theory about the subject and signifier, because the examples themselves embed a logic of authentication inside. The circular components of the unary 1 and OGA play out over the variety of ways repetition creates sequences that then create the rules they intend to break, the games that will end in riots, the governments that will get blown up by anarchists. If Anselm hadn't been trying to prove the existence of God by saying it was all a question of limits, he could be hired to be a cultural anthropologist like Arnold van Gennep or Victor Turner, who showed how the marginal cases were actually central to cultural formation. This technique for studying the inversive as inductive is itself inversive and inductive. It uses error as the active ingredient in creating the voids that ground our sense experience of the world, to the extent that the best place to find the unconscious as pure invisible structure is precisely in the visible world. Everything that gets a thumbs down in experience shows up as structure in the unconscious, but the machine is reversible. We can invert the negation to see how it is already present as an operator in the creation of visible reality. But to do this, we have to run the film backwards, to see how what for us seems to be entropy is actually the emergence factor within visibility, the factor that we see only as appearance with something spooky about it. Lacan's butterfly is a good place to start, because the screen is like the apogee of the curve, where the effects of the limit can be seen in high definition. The screen is at a midpoint, where the cones of vision meet, cross, and cross-contaminate. We say that the cone of vision is a dilation machine, since it starts at an imaginary point and expands to take in everything that is extended. The butterfly, however, argues that dilation is always accompanied by an opposing force that contracts to hold the cone in place and in shape. This works by means of the ways that various cultures distinguish figures from ground and name them once a profile is drawn to set them in front of whatever lay behind. The next few slides are fairly complex, but they promise to take a giant step into the aspect of subjectivity that is the most commonplace, the most accepted, the most normalized. We say we agree with others because we see things the same way. The visible is simultaneously a private matter and a social consensus. The antagonism between public and private never stops. That's what makes it a cultural condition par excellence. Perception begins when we draw an edge around a space, then fill it with stuff. At the same time, we empty it out of other stuff we throw into the background. The figure has a profile, like a silhouette. It blocks our view of whatever is behind it. So every figure is a negation of a zone behind it that is invisible. The look of the subject has trouble thinking about this. The gaze has a kind of X-ray vision that seems to see through from the back of opaque objects. If you can pause to read some of the notes in this slide, I make the argument that the opacity of the visible object that is a figure against the ground is a bit like the relation of the big other, the plenum of everything visible, to the barred A, autre, the bar being like the perimeter of the figure. I don't want to be too literal about this connection. What is key is that the perimeter of the object produces the idea of the vanishing point that is the limit of all objects in the visual field. It is inside the visible, in the same way the center is in the middle of a perfect circle. Let's rotate the object to the side so that we see the butterfly as a relation that takes place along a line that extends from this imaginary center point to connect the subject's eye to the construct of another eye, an object eye. This uses the barred A to fashion the full A other, which uses the horizon of the visible to be radically invisible. The vanishing point is the hole in space beyond which the gaze reigns supreme. No matter where we look, it is the same gaze that looks back. The circularity of the horizon conceals the gaze and makes it a unary trait, a plenum. Don't get too caught up in all the labels. The aim of this graphic is to help you configure the butterfly to see the roles of the three Borromean domains. Again, we have the 2-to-1 ratio. With every figure, there is a duplicitous ground, where the real holds hands with the symbolic. But the grasp can fall apart. It takes the imaginary, working in the negative, to establish the sagittal connection between the subjective eye and the objective gaze. This is what gives the visual image its authority and authenticity. We fantasize that truth comes from beyond the horizon, which is why the magical eye is on the top of the pyramid in the Masonic symbol we see on the US dollar bill. The sagittal dimension and figure ground profile are so important for Lacanian theory. This page is chock-a-block with notes about how the cut of the screen makes it a hinge representing both the accident aspect of perception with the idea that the visible is given to us for some predetermined reason. Take some time to read these notes and feel free to critique the points. There is very little theory written about visual experience in Lacanian psychoanalysis because, in case you hadn't noticed, most Lacanians are okay writing books without any pictures. To this day, there are people who prefer books to the movies. Gallagher either omits or poorly draws the materials that Lacan richly spread throughout his lectures. Even the comparatively lavishly illustrated Stafferla French editions sometimes make drawing mistakes. One thing we can't ignore is that Lacan was a great visualizer. Pen or chalk in hand, he didn't hesitate to put his words into drawings. What's key here, in the detailed notes, is that the figure ground distinction produces all the rest of what we call perspective. Zizek's idea of parallax skips forward to an analogy without taking time to see how Lacan actually uses perspective to develop a model for inter- and trans-subjectivity. He's left the visual party a bit too soon. I urge you to stay to the end of the party to get the funniest jokes and the best dancing. This is when Lacan pulls out examples like The Ravishing of Lol v. Stein, Las Meninas, or some other art masterpiece, not to interpret them, but to let them change our minds about what actually happens. These notes have given you some idea of what might go on when the Lacanian terminology of the unary trait and objet A are put into the true-false logic of triplicity. We have a link, then, to the role of error and negation in visual experience. We see how abstractions, such as the name of the Father, might be pulled into the geometry of a painting, like the mirror at the back of the room of Velázquez's famous painting. Here, an artist quite distant from psychoanalysis confirms what we have been saying about inversion and induction. He uses triplicity with such virtuosity that we might say of him what Lacan said of Marguerite Duras, that she seemed to know his teaching, without having cracked a book. These corroborations are more reliable than simply duplicating a lab experiment. They are truly independent, truly disinterested in the aims of the analytic session. The only catch here is that we have to develop an eye for the case, where the work of culture tells us about clinical psyche. Scotty cracks open the backroom door in Hitchcock's Vertigo. We have to be ready to see how the mirror on the door inverts the object of desire in a way that we will discover to have been already inverted, so that what we see is an invisibility, a gaze, an interest returned on our investment of desire. In this case, the literary device of ekphrasis, description in words of something we can't see, is reversed, and we see beyond the character in the story who thinks he sees what he sees. Yet this sighted character's blindness will be precisely what pulls us into the story, making ekphrasis and the unreliable narrator into a contronym with a magnetic field, giving us a compass to navigate the field. We must invent a new vocabulary out of the tools we use, like Lacan's sideways butterfly, so that when we look at works of art and culture, we know where to draw the lines. Lucky for us, artists with their wits about them seem to know how to employ things like the butterfly 200 years before Lacan wrote Seminar 11. The ultra-realism of Las Meninas seems normal, but with a shift of the mirror to the side of the vanishing point involves a cathesis, which is to say a doubling of visual systems, that require us to see how there are two frames within the image. Again, a 2-to-1 ratio that we could describe with an interior 8 or extrapolate with the 3 circles of triplicity. We can't learn the new vocabulary overnight, but we can make sure that we move step by step and at every point use terms that Lacan himself uses, such as basculer and furrow, or understand that when he says cut, he means the cut of Popilius, who defends Egypt by drawing a circle around its would-be conqueror. By sticking with Lacan's own adventurous visual imagination, we rediscover figures and forms that had long been held prisoner by agonizing annotations, reducing their visual integrity into abstract captions. Fragmentation and abstraction were not Lacan's strength. He liked redundancies. He repositioned his figures so that we would see the connections for ourselves. The L-schema comes nearly a decade before the official start of Lacan's topological interests. But he already had the idea of twisted space, where basculation will open up a sagittal hole in the otherwise Euclidean space between the analyst and analysand. We already know that the clinical patient cannot be trusted, that the truth will come in the langue of errors in speech, and that only the analyst's ear knows how to tune into this talk, whose closest analogy is the jazz singer's use of scat. What is error in the imaginary is pure gold for the evenly distributed attention of the analyst-trained ear, and the triplicity of error, as it attempts but fails to form a lie, resorts to duplicities and then outright inversions, sets up the ideal time and place for the formation of a clear void where the imaginary will give way to the real of analysis. The particulars of the analytical session, diagrammed by the L-schema, will quickly give way to more global issues, such as the relation of chance to necessity. The real question, of course, is chance of what, and necessity for what. These open up the mysteries of the constructed other, that is barred by the butterfly and logicked by triplicity, in the voice that is the structure of the unconscious. The hope is that, with this reconnection to Lacan's own energetic visualizations, We find new ways of theorizing that fulfill the promise of his mi-dire technique, of saying only half of what needs to be said. On one hand, we force ourselves to pay more attention to things like the fundamental polygon of the torus, where the literal visual form turns out to be a logic of paired vectors, and those paired vectors paired again. You will hear the echo of the powers of A in this doubling. On the other hand, these reconnections will extend past what Lacan gives us literally, to what he hopes we might discover for ourselves, namely the missing diagrams and unmentioned features that take things like the L-schema and write new scripts. Ethnology should be our guide. We should find examples that let us check our work against the chance versus necessity structures of human cultural life. We should step away from the usual historicist account of Lacan's development to see a foundational anachronism. The most compelling reason for this is that Lacan's first topological idea comes at the very beginning of his career, with the Three Prisoners' Dilemma, a story that is the most commonly given example of the induction puzzle. This early outlier forces us to invent a new name for Lacan's thinking, where we have to come to terms with what he knows but he doesn't know. The proper word for this, kenosis, opens up a new dimension of our critical thinking adventures with Lacan. It alerts us to the different ways he has already been thinking about the topological features of self-intersection and non-orientation, because he has already diversified his portfolio with ideas of induction and inversion. By the time we reach the Borromeo knots and Brownian braids of the late Lacan, we will be saying that linear time doesn't count for much, that Lacan's anachronistic time travel is just a case of what he said at the beginning, that there is an empirical time, and, inside this convention, a logical time. From the butterfly to the L-schema, where the sagittal connection between the subject eye and object eye is converted by dilation and cathesis to a self-intersecting and non-orientable dimension that is confirmed by the Mobius band we find in the R-schema, a new light shines on the way the clinical session terminates in the moment Lacan called traversing the fantasy. Although it is the real that is the effective cause of this event, it is the symbolic as structure, a structure conditioned by the negations of the unconscious, that sync up with the negations of error and inversion within the visual field of the imaginary. This is the point where an entirely novel methodology finds the opportunity to shift gears to the issue of emergence. Again, there are common features, such as the idea of the moving middle term, that connect the logical condition with perceptual experience and clinical evaluation. In the process of validating this conceptual leap, we return to examples found in Lacan's earlier work. In Seminar 7, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, the story of Apollo and Daphne can be reread through a prism we did not construct until Seminar 13, The Object of Psychoanalysis. What now catches our eye is Daphne's paralysis, which involves induction and inversion. Again, we find a 2-to-1 ratio, where the duplicity of her desire to flee requires a surface where flight is consistent, but she doesn't find this surface. Instead, the space on every side of her position is spherical. There is in this closed curved surface an equal amount of resistance. She becomes the embodiment of the principle of cathesis, which cancels out difference with a movement of perspective, because the horizon and vanishing point will always travel with the eye. This turns the logic of the story towards a beginning that Lacan does not cite. This is the debate between Apollo and Eros about the latter's poor archery skills. The boy god is stung by Apollo's mockery that the wrong people always end up falling in love, and fashions 2 arrows, or maybe one arrow, able to inflict love in Apollo, but hate in Daphne. Again, the 2-to-1 ratio. And again, we have a case of induction with inversion. Paralysis is, however, the thing that stings us most vividly when we feel Daphne's anguish, at the same time she realizes the futility of flight. New levels of the story open up new levels of theory. Every one thing involves two things, and their duplicity opens up a theoretical void as much as a mythical void.